Welcome back, everyone. I'm excited to give the floor to Susan Myers, Fidelity Investments Chief Privacy Officer, to give us her thoughts on the evolving privacy landscape.
Great, excellent. So I'm still excited to be here, and I'll just start from the beginning here. And we'll start off with a cartoon here, given that it's back to school season. And here we have a young student who's refusing to put his name on the board until he knows how his data is being used. And this is certainly a kid after my own heart, and I think something that you all in this audience can relate to as far as how your data is being used. And I think this highlights the tension that we're seeing and the striving for balance that we're seeing in the legal and regulatory space. So it's this balance of these natural tensions of opposing perspectives and how we resolve that. And we're really seeing this in three main areas. The first one, probably the most obvious one, is this tension between consumer convenience and ease for the customer and the individual fear of surveillance. And we talked in the last panel about the paranoid crypto investor. This is exactly what's playing out here. This conversation has certainly been more public over the past few years, with prominent consumer advocates really bringing the conversation to the forefront, with Alastair McTaggart pushing for the California Consumer Privacy Act, Edward Snowden with the NSA case regarding telecommunications, and more recently, Max Schrems in the Facebook cases. Another area where we're seeing this tension is within companies and entities, where in many ways data is power, and gathering as much data that you have is a business differentiator. But companies and entities need to balance that with what is the risk of managing that data, and what is the liability of having all that data. So that's something that we're seeing play out in this space as well. And then the last piece, and this is more recent with the advent of COVID, is really the balance of, or the tension between individual privacy rights and data for the greater good. So contact tracing, temperature scanning, all of that has a natural tension. How much are you willing to give up for the community? And then what happens to that data after that crisis? So what I want to talk about in the next few minutes is the privacy law and the privacy landscape up to now and how we got here, then talk about what we're seeing in the current landscape, and then finally talk about what that might look like over the next couple of years. So in the past 50 years, prior to 2018, we've seen probably 7 pieces of major privacy legislation. So starting with the US Privacy Act, this was an act in 1974 that talked about how the US government could use data. Fast forward to 95, where the EU gets into the game, and the EU Data Protection Directive was really the precursor to GDPR. Obviously HIPAA for medical information in 96, and then GLBA, so financial services, was impacted certainly by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which had a lot to say about disclosure for individuals. It had a lot to say about requirements of policy and procedure regarding safeguarding customer information. And then starting in 2002, we started to see the states in the US get into the act. And this is when we first saw the first state breach law. And that went on until 2018. And at that point, all 50 US states had some sort of data breach law. That was also the year, obviously, where GDPR came into effect. And that is something that's been a game changer. And in GDPR, we saw the first major piece of legislation that talked about consumer rights, this idea of the right to be forgotten, the right to know what information customers or companies have on you. So that went into effect in 2018. About 2 months later, within the course of a month, the California Consumer Privacy Act was passed. So now we're seeing this trend, or at least I think it's the beginning of a trend, where we're seeing this rapid movement toward these consumer or individual rights in the privacy space. At the beginning of this year, in 2020, we saw about more than 70 privacy bills. So various state legislatures, global jurisdictions were looking at privacy in their legislatures and the parliaments. A lot of that went by the wayside with COVID-19, but we think that that's something that will come back in 2021. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if we look at where we are right now and what's happening with the landscape, I see this in three main areas. So new and unsettled law. So the law is evolving or about to evolve in this case. Enforcement and litigation, and then also the evolving marketplace. So with regard to the new and unsettled law, it's all about consumer rights at this point. So California was the first one in the US to have these consumer rights, a right to be forgotten, right to know, right to opt out. But since then, we've seen other states get into the mix. And there have been many other states in the US that are actually looking at this as a possibility in coming years. So I think this is a trend that we'll continue to see going forward. Also data management, and specifically here, this idea of data minimization. So that natural tension between how much does a company collect for data, how much do they maintain for data, and how much are they willing to risk, and what sort of liability are they willing to take on having that data. So that's always been a risk for companies. Now what we're seeing in this space is it's actually codified in the law. So GDPR has language regarding data minimization. A couple of the bills that we've seen in the US speak to data minimization. So this is another trend that I expect that we'll see more of going forward. And then COVID-19. So we haven't had any specific laws passed in this space, at least in the US, but there's certainly been a lot of discussion about how much do you give up individual privacy to address this crisis. And again, what happens with that data once the crisis is over? In the enforcement and litigation space, what we're seeing under GDPR, so GDPR has been in effect for 2 years now, we've seen several large cases, in this case related to breaches. So we've seen fines in a couple $100 million coming out of the EU in this space. So very significant exposure, potential for exposure here. Again, going back to that question of how much data do you have, how are you managing that data? So significant risk in this space. We're also seeing states increasing their focus. So we talked about each state having a breach law, but now we're starting to see more focus on enforcement. So as many of you may have seen, the California Attorney General has been very vocal about the fact that he and his office will be enforcing the California Consumer Privacy Act. Also recently in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Attorney General created a new agency regarding data protection to actually enforce the Massachusetts data privacy law. So we're seeing states really get involved in this as well, especially in the absence of a federal law at this stage. And then also what we're seeing is this idea of a private right of action. So in California, there is a provision in the California Consumer Privacy Act that allows individual consumers to bring private lawsuits in the event that their data is breached under certain circumstances. So here we have this tension in the law that's resolving toward the consumer, putting the power back in the hands of the consumer to sue in the cases of these breaches. And that's something, again, we've seen that in several bills that have been on the table this year in various jurisdictions. And then, of course, all of this has to be balanced against the evolving marketplace. So what are customer expectations in this case? In the last panel, we talked about customer expectations regarding privacy, and there were really mixed opinions on how important this is to customers. They think they want privacy, but then do they give that up in the case of convenience? So that's something that's still playing out that the law and policymakers are reacting to. Also, innovations demand the use of data. So again, data is power. The more that we can predict results, predict consumer behaviors, that's power for an organization. But how far do we go and how far are consumers willing to give up their data is certainly an area that's still being worked through. And then external privacy risk ratings. So now we're seeing companies come up that are actually giving corporations and entities risk ratings and how well they're doing. So a company who's had very public breaches would have a lower risk score, a lower rating score than a company who hasn't had those issues. So this is something that's very much an issue for an organization's reputation, and something that organizations have to be very concerned about, in addition to the law in this space. So as we look ahead for the privacy outlook in 2021 and beyond, again, there was a lot of activity, a lot of discussion, especially at the U.S. state level in this space. I expect we'll see more of that post-election in 2021, and I'm seeing this in three main areas. So the first one is state data breach laws. So we've seen over the past couple of years these laws expanding and getting stricter at the state level. One area that we're seeing is the expansion of personal information. So historically with breach laws, we saw the basics of name plus SSN was the data that was required for a breach. Now we're seeing that expanded, where personal information could be financial account numbers, it could be IP address. So I think we'll continue to see that trend where the personal information is much more than PII in the future. We've also seen, and I think we'll continue to see this trend, more states require that you notify an entity such as the state attorney general, in addition to notifying the individual in a case of breach. So breaches will become much more public in light of these laws. The second area that we're seeing is the consumer privacy rights. So I talked about this a minute ago. On the heels of GDPR and CCPA, other states are jumping into the mix here with regard to the right to request data, right to delete data, right to opt out. We're also seeing this globally. So India is looking at a consumer rights bill. We anticipate seeing something around that, probably Q1 of next year, but a lot of momentum in India about getting a consumer rights law on the books in that country. And then enforcement and preemption. I talked a bit about the enforcement and what we're seeing from the state level. There's also been a lot of discussion at the federal level. So, when we talk about the evolving law, one of the first questions people have is, well, what about the U.S. federal? Is there going to be a U.S. federal bill? The sense that I have now is that there's general agreement that there should be some sort of federal privacy law. I think both parties would agree that something needs to be done about privacy, but we're seeing a split across the parties here, where Democrats generally favor more privacy rights, more of the private right of action for consumers, and Republicans aren't as willing to go with that private right of action, and they also want to have a federal law that preempts all the state laws so that we're not managing this 50-state patchwork. Now, I don't see much momentum for a federal law, at least over the next couple of months with the election looming ahead, but we can certainly expect this conversation to continue at the federal level as well as the U.S. state level as we get into 2021 and beyond. So definitely stay tuned to this space as we see how this evolves. And so the question at this point is, what's the solution to all of this? And how does this all get resolved? And in my opinion, the solution is not an end state. The solution really is the continuing tension, the continuing discussion, striving for that balance, and continuing to push each other across the balance between ease versus surveillance, too much data versus too much risk, and continuing to have those conversations as we work to strike that balance. To me, that's where the innovation is, that's where the growth is. So I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with all of you over the coming weeks and months and over the next several years. So thank you very much for your attention today. More important, thank you for this great dialogue over the past couple of days. It's been fantastic hearing from all of you, and really looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that comprehensive overview and for giving us like actual data around this idea that sensitive data is increasingly becoming a liability that businesses and regulators have to consider.